The wind was still, as if even nature dared not breathe in the aftermath of massacre. The battlefield of Karbala lay silent, bathed in the golden blush of dawn, but it bore the shadows of a night soaked in blood. Spears stood like grave markers in the sand, their tips glinting with the memory of violence. Torn banners fluttered weakly, whispering the names of those who would never again answer a call. Amid the wreckage of tents and bodies, a lone figure knelt. His back was hunched, his face hidden beneath a green, dust-stained cloak, his hands bound in shackles that dragged across the earth with every movement. He was still, except for the subtle trembling of his shoulders as he breathed. Imam Zain-ul-Abideen, the son of Hussein, the last male survivor from the line of the Prophet in Karbala, was alive, but barely. Fever coursed through his veins like fire. His legs throbbed from illness and the strain of chains biting into his ankles. His voice was lost somewhere in the echoes of the night's cries. Around him, the women and children of the Prophet's household clung to one another, their eyes hollow with trauma. Lady Zainab stood with her veil torn, dust in her hair, holding young Sakinah against her chest. There were no tears left, only silence, deep, echoing silence that said more than any scream ever could. A soldier kicked over the remnants of a cooking pot, letting the ash scatter into the wind. Another one laughed, lifting a severed head high upon a spear. But the Imam did not look up. He could not. His body was wrecked, his soul bruised, but he was not broken. Beneath the folds of pain, something glowed. He pressed his forehead to the sand, a whisper of Sajdah that would go unseen, unheard by the world, yet thunder in the heavens. His worship had survived the bloodshed, the chains, and the death of everyone he had loved. This was no ordinary man. This was the Sajdah, the one who prostrates, offering his prayer not in comfort, but in captivity. Lady Zainab moved beside him, her steps slow, her shoulders heavy under the weight of leadership now thrust upon her. She knelt, lifting his head gently. Ali, she whispered, using the name his father had given him. Her voice trembled, but her gaze was steady. The women, they need to move. The soldiers grow restless. We must go. He nodded faintly. Speaking cost him too much, so he remained silent. But in that silence, a mountain of grief and resolve stood tall. He turned his face toward the battlefield one last time. The body of his father lay somewhere beyond the dust, trampled and headless, surrounded by broken swords and scattered belongings. He could still see Abbas near the Euphrates, Zainab's sons, Qasim's torn garments. The memories clung like ghosts. He clenched his jaw. A rough tug at the chains pulled him forward. One of the guards grunted impatiently. "Move, son of Hussein," he spat, gripping the iron links that shackled the Imam's wrists. "Your time of glory is over." The Imam stumbled, catching himself against a half-burnt tent post. Blood seeped through the soles of his sandals. He did not speak back. Not because he feared, but because his silence spoke louder. Every step was a prayer. Every restraint a verse of endurance. The path forward was not just a journey through cities, it was a journey through humiliation, agony, and divine patience. As the group of captives began their slow march toward Kufa, a cloud of dust rose behind them. Children cried for water. Women shielded one another from the harsh sun. But amid them, the Imam moved like a ghost in chains. At one point, a child tripped and fell. He bent down to lift her with bound hands, murmuring something soft. A soldier shouted at him to keep moving. Another laughed and whipped the air for intimidation. Imam Zain-ul-Abideen straightened, eyes on the horizon. His body bore weakness, but his presence was a flame that would not go out. They passed by the battlefield edge. The Imam paused, his eyes locking with a banner half buried in sand. It was the standard of his uncle Abbas, still upright, even though its bearer had fallen. A wind stirred then, for the first time in hours, lifting a corner of the Imam's green cloak. It felt like a touch from the unseen, a message from the martyrs. He whispered, voice cracked from thirst, "Peace be upon you, O Father. Peace be upon you, O Abbas. The mission lives on." Lady Zainab approached him again, placing a hand on his arm. "Ali," she said, her voice quieter now, "they are watching. And these children, they look to you. Even if we are bound, we must walk like we are free. He turned to her, eyes hollow yet burning. And they shall learn what patience means, he said hoarsely. As they moved farther from Karbala, the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift. The soil of martyrdom gave way to roads lined with onlookers and hostility. Yet in the Imam's heart, the battlefield remained. Every breath, every heartbeat, was a remembrance. Behind him, the land whispered names, Hussein, Abbas, Qasim, Akbar, and ahead of him, tyranny waited in thrones and palaces. But none of it shook his core. A girl beside him began crying. The Imam leaned slightly and murmured a verse from the Qur'an, soothing her until her sobs softened. The soldier behind them scowled. He thinks he's still their leader, he muttered to another. Let him talk. Let him pray. Damascus will break what Karbala did not. But even the guard's venom couldn't pierce the air around the Imam. There was something holy in his stillness, something luminous in his gaze. Every step was part of a divine script now. The captives were not just walking toward a tyrant's court, they were walking into history, into legacy, into light. As the sun rose higher, casting its brutal glow across the desert path, a shadow followed them. But so did a promise, the promise that chains cannot silence the truth, and oppression cannot erase the legacy of those who prostrated on the sands of sacrifice. The Imam stumbled once more, the weight of chains and memory pulling him down. A soldier moved to strike him, but stopped. Something in the Imam's eyes froze his hand mid-air. He had seen men die without fear, but never had he seen a man suffer this much and still look victorious. And so, the soldier lowered his hand. Imam Zain-ul-Abideen continued walking. And the chains sang with every step. The desert stretched endlessly, a path of stone and heat beneath bruised feet and blistered memories. The caravan of captives moved slowly, shadowed by armed soldiers and scorched by a pitiless sun. Imam Zain-ul-Abideen walked at the center, his wrists chained, ankles raw, his every step echoing with restraint. Around him, the women of the Prophet's household whispered prayers beneath torn veils, while children clung to one another, eyes wide with a fear they could not name. The air smelled of dust and despair, and each village they passed grew crueler with its silence or sharper with its insults. Yet the Imam never once lowered his gaze. His body ached beyond measure, the fever from his illness still simmering in his veins. But pain had become a second skin now, no heavier than the chains. What truly crushed him were the memories. Every gust of wind seemed to carry voices, his father's last call, the battle cry of Abbas, the breathless farewell of Ali Akbar. At night, when the caravan stopped and the prisoners were thrown to the ground like cattle, the Imam would sit in silence, his eyes fixed on the stars, seeking the faces that once shone beside him. Lady Zainab moved like a pillar, tired but unbroken. She tended to the children, guarded her nephew with the fierce resolve of a lioness who had already seen too many cubs fall. On one such night, she approached the Imam, her hands cupped around a small crust of stale bread. "It's not enough," she said softly, "but it's something." He accepted it without words, breaking it in half to share with a child nearby. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and though they didn't speak, they understood. They were carrying a legacy that had bled into the earth but refused to die. As they neared the outskirts of Kufa, the tension thickened. A commander barked orders, soldiers tightened their formation, and the captives were forced to straighten as if their dignity could still be taken. Crowds began to gather, eyes curious, mocking, some confused. Women whispered behind veils, children pointed, and men watched with a mix of guilt and detachment. Imam Zain-ul-Abideen felt their stares like knives. A little girl beside him asked, "Uncle, why are they looking at us like we are criminals?" He looked down at her, his voice barely audible. "Because they forgot what truth looks like." The gates of Kufa opened not with ceremony, but with chaos. Stones flew, insults rained. One boy aimed a pebble at the Imam's face, hitting him just above the eyebrow. Blood trickled down, but he didn't flinch. A woman stepped forward, ready to spit at Lady Zainab, but stopped when she saw her eyes, burning not with hatred, but with sorrow that turned hearts to ash. Murmurs rose from the crowd. "Who are these prisoners?" They don't look like rebels. That one, he looks like the prophet. In the center square, the captives were paraded like war trophies. Ibn Ziyad sat upon his throne, bloated with pride, his cruelty masked with formality. Imam Zain-ul-Abideen was dragged forward, the chain pulled so hard it cut into his neck. Yet he stood, or rather remained upright despite his wounds. A soldier announced him mockingly, "This is the son of Hussein, the grandson of Ali, the bloodline of the man your father claimed to follow." Ibn Ziyad sneered. "So, you are Ali ibn Hussein. How did Allah deal with your father?" The Imam's voice came low but clear, slicing through the hall with divine fire. He honored him with martyrdom and granted him a place among the righteous. "And as for you, O Ibn Ziyad, time will tell where your path leads." The hall stiffened. No one had spoken like that to the governor before. A hush fell. Some guards exchanged uneasy glances. But Ibn Ziyad only chuckled bitterly. "You are bold for a boy in chains." The Imam met his eyes. Chains have never silenced the truth. That night, they were thrown into a dungeon. The floor was cold, wet, and smelled of rot. Children cried from hunger. Lady Zainab whispered lullabies, her voice cracked but soothing. Imam Zain-ul-Abideen sat with his back against the wall, breathing slowly. In the dark, he whispered du'as, not for deliverance, but for strength. Across from him, Imam Muhammad Baqir, still a child, sat curled beside his father. "Baba, why did they hurt Nana Hussein?" he asked in a trembling voice. The Imam opened his eyes. "Because Nana stood when others bowed. Because he chose Allah when others chose comfort. And because the world fears those who remind it of its own injustice." The child leaned against him, and for a moment, there was peace, even in that dungeon. Days later, the caravan was ordered to move again. This time toward Damascus, to the court of Yazid himself. The journey would be longer, crueler, and more public. Whispers of their arrival had already reached cities ahead. The Imam overheard soldiers talking. Yazid wants them humiliated. He wants the people to cheer as they pass. But humiliation is a weapon that only works if the heart accepts it. Imam Zain-ul-Abideen carried sorrow, but not shame. In every town they entered, he walked upright, despite fever and chains. People began to question. In one village, a man spat near them, then heard a child softly reciting the Qur'an. He froze, looked at the chained child, and saw light in his face. "Who are they?" he whispered. The soldier replied, "Descendants of the Prophet. Enemies of the state." The man stepped back in horror. "Then the state is the enemy of the Prophet." Word spread. In hushed tones, in trembling voices, people began to realize who these captives were. In one town, an old woman threw a scarf to Lady Zainab, weeping. In another, food was secretly passed into the caravan at night. Fear couldn't silence every heart. Some still beat in rhythm with justice. One night, beneath a sky scattered with stars, the Imam sat alone. The soldiers had dozed, the children were asleep, and only the chains whispered in the quiet. He looked up, his face drawn but calm. "O Allah," he murmured, "you see me. You have always seen me. I do not ask you to lighten the burden. Only grant me the strength to carry it." The wind stirred gently, brushing against his cheeks like a mother's hand. He bowed his head. Even in chains, he found the strength to fall into Sajdah. Even in the depths of injustice, he still rose with dignity. And the journey continued, the light refusing to dim. Damascus shimmered under the sun like a mirage, golden domes, polished stone streets, and towering walls that glistened with the pride of a tyrant. But for the chained caravan approaching its gates, it was not a city. It was a stage where cruelty would be paraded, and humiliation rehearsed for an audience taught to cheer at injustice. Imam Zain-ul-Abideen walked at the center of that caravan, his face pale, his eyes rimmed with fatigue, but his spine straight. The fever had not left him. His ankles bled beneath the iron cuffs. Yet his steps did not falter. For every drop of blood, every ache in his body, was a testimony, his presence itself, a sermon no tyrant could silence. The people had gathered in droves. From balconies and rooftops, they watched the spectacle unfold. Trumpets blared. A man stood shouting, "These are the rebels from Karbala, the traitors who rose against our caliph." The crowd, unfamiliar with the truth, began to cheer. But among them, a few faces darkened with confusion. One woman gasped, pointing to the Imam. "That face, he looks like the messenger of Allah." Whispers bloomed like wildfire. Some voices trembled as they asked, "Who are they really?" Soldiers dragged the captives through the city center, their chains clinking like echoes of injustice across marble and dust. Women from the Prophet's household lowered their eyes, not from shame, but from dignity. Lady Zainab, veiled in humility and sorrow, held Imam Muhammad Bakir close. The child's small hands were blistered, his lips cracked from thirst. The Imam reached back and placed a weak but steady hand over his son's shoulder. He did not speak. His silence carried the weight of generations. They reached the courtyard of Yazid's palace. It stood tall and proud, carved with verses of power but empty of mercy. The captives were forced to stand in a line under the sun, their feet blistering against heated stone. Yazid sat upon a golden throne shaded by silk, flanked by his courtiers and guards. A goblet of wine rested in his hand, his laughter loud, forced, echoing across the courtyard as if mocking heaven itself. He looked upon the prisoners like a man surveying a conquered land. The Imam was brought forward. A soldier shoved him to his knees, but he steadied himself before hitting the ground. A ripple of unease passed through the onlookers. Despite everything, this prisoner carried himself like a king. Yazid smirked. "So this is the son of Hussein," he said, drawing out the words as if tasting them. "You come here in chains, barefoot, humiliated. And yet you look at me as if you still wear a crown." The Imam's gaze did not waver. A crown given by people is worthless. But the crown of truth remains even in chains. Yazid's jaw clenched. The court grew tense. The guards shifted. A few eyes among the nobles blinked in discomfort. But Yazid quickly laughed, louder than before, trying to drown out what he had just heard. "Bring him to the pulpit," he ordered with a cruel grin. "Let's see what the boy has to say. Let the people hear him. If he truly carries the blood of the Prophet, let him speak." At first, the guards hesitated. Then they dragged Imam Zain-ul-Abideen up the steps of the wooden platform built in the center of the courtyard. His knees shook beneath him, the fever rising again. A soldier whispered mockingly, "If you fall, the crowd will laugh." But the Imam, steadying himself against the pulpit, said softly, "If I fall, the heavens will weep." He stood beneath the sky, the sun piercing down, and with a voice strained but resolute, he began. "O people of Damascus! I am the son of Mecca and Medina. I am the son of Zamzam and Safa. I am the son of the one who was lifted upon the shoulders of Jibril. I am the son of Fatima al-Zahra. I am the son of the man who was slaughtered by the banks of the Euphrates." Each word struck the crowd like thunder. Eyes widened. Faces paled. The cheers died into stunned silence. Some dropped their gazes, ashamed. Others wept openly. The Imam, once thought to be a criminal, now stood illuminated by the truth of his lineage, each sentence peeling away the lies stitched by the Yazidi regime. Yazid shifted uncomfortably on his throne. He had not expected the boy to speak with such fire. "Enough!" he shouted. "Silence him!" But the Imam had already spoken enough. His voice still echoed through the hearts of those present. The damage to Yazid's illusion was done. That night, in the quiet of the dungeon, Imam Zain-ul-Abideen sat alone, his back against the cold stone wall. His body trembled from fever, but his mind was clear. Across from him, Imam Muhammad Bakir lay asleep, head on Lady Zainab's lap. The stars above were distant, peeking through a barred window. He looked up at them and remembered the battlefield, the silence after the cries, the blood-soaked soil, the torn flag of Abbas still flapping in the dust. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer not of escape, but of endurance. "O Lord, you saw me when no one else did. You gave me breath when it could have been easier to die. Make this suffering count. Make this blood remembered." The chains around his wrists clinked faintly as he shifted to the side and slowly, painfully, bent forward into Sajdah. His forehead met the cold ground, and in that moment, the dungeon became a sanctuary. The angels bore witness as the grandson of the prophet, weak in body but unshaken in soul, bowed in submission not to tyranny, but to the most merciful. Outside, the city buzzed with rumors. People whispered of the young man who spoke like a prophet and stood like a lion in chains. The false image Yazid had built now cracked. No longer could he parade the family of the prophet without resistance from the hearts he failed to control. And so, beneath the golden skies of Damascus, a light began to spread, not from palaces or pulpits of power, but from a sick, shackled man whose Sajdah taught the world that no chain could bind the truth. The days in Damascus passed not with the rhythm of peace, but under the constant weight of humiliation and surveillance. The captives of Karbala, those noble souls who had survived the greatest tragedy known to the Islamic world, were treated as criminals within the palace walls of Yazid. Yet behind those same walls, something profound stirred. The people had begun to ask questions. The echo of Imam Zain-ul-Abideen's sermon still vibrated through the hearts of those who heard it, and his silent resilience gnawed at the false grandeur Yazid tried to maintain. Imam Zain-ul-Abideen, despite his illness and the heavy toll of grief, became the moral center of a palace drowning in corruption. Every night he prostrated on the cold stones of his prison cell, forehead pressed to dust, whispering verses that seemed to pull the heavens closer. His chains were never truly silent. They moved with him like reluctant companions, echoing through the corridors, reminding even the gods that holiness could reside in suffering. The child Imam Muhammad Baqir, barely old enough to grasp the full scale of the tragedy, began to follow in his father's footsteps. He asked questions softly, always watching. "Why doesn't Yazid fear Allah, Baba?" he once asked. The Imam looked at his son with a gaze steeped in sorrow but carved from steel. "Because hearts sealed by arrogance can no longer hear the truth, my son. But one day, truth will find its voice again." Meanwhile, Lady Zainab had become a quiet storm within the palace. She walked with grace that unsettled even the most hardened of gods. Though veiled and tired, her words were sharp when needed, her silence even sharper. She reminded them not of a captive but of a commander who had watched empires crumble, and still stood tall. She tended to the other women and children, but her eyes always lingered on her nephew. He was not just her blood, he was the torchbearer now. One morning, the guards arrived abruptly. Yazid summons the captives, one barked, not hiding his disdain. The Imam stood slowly, pain evident in his movements. The fever had worsened, his lips cracked, but his eyes still held the fire of Karbala. He motioned for the children to stay close and whispered to his aunt, "It is not over yet." They were brought into Yazid's grand chamber, where opulence stretched endlessly, golden chandeliers, velvet curtains, silken carpets. But none of it impressed the souls who had seen Karbala. Yazid sat slouched on his throne, trying to maintain a facade of control, yet there was something uneasy in the way he gripped his goblet. "You've caused unrest," he said coldly, addressing the Imam. "The people whisper. They doubt what I've told them. You speak too eloquently for a prisoner." The Imam looked at him, silent at first. Then, in a voice neither loud nor trembling, he said, "Perhaps it is not my words that frighten you. Perhaps it is the truth they carry." A murmur passed through the court. Yazid rose slightly, then hesitated. There was no sword in the Imam's hand, yet Yazid felt cornered. "I could kill you here," he snapped. "You could," the Imam said, unmoved. "But know this, blood spilled in silence sometimes speaks louder than armies. You killed my father before thousands, and yet his name grows. What do you think would happen if you killed his son here, now, before witnesses again?" The room fell into a thick silence. Yazid's smirk faltered. He leaned back slowly, trying to laugh it off. "So be it," he said. "You wish to leave? Go back to Medina. I have given you your life." The Imam did not bow. He merely nodded once. "You gave me nothing. My life belongs to the one who never abandoned me, not in chains, not in fire, not in grief." By evening, preparations began for the captives' return. The people of Damascus, many of whom had once cheered their humiliation, now gathered quietly along the roads. Some brought water, others brought cloths. A few wept openly, begging for forgiveness. The transformation had begun. Yazid could not undo what Karbala had planted in hearts now awakened by truth. Before leaving, the Imam asked to visit the site where the heads of the martyrs had been displayed. When they reached the spot, he knelt, placing his hand upon the ground. He whispered prayers for each of the fallen, his father Hussein, his uncle Abbas, his brother Ali Akbar, his cousin Qasim, his baby brother Ali Asghar. His voice trembled at each name, but he did not cry. His tears had been buried with the martyrs. What remained was fire, a fire that would warm generations who would follow. The journey back to Medina was long. On the way, the Imam stopped in Karbala. The battlefield had not forgotten. Bones still lay beneath the sand. The Euphrates still flowed nearby, its waters stained by memory. Imam Zain-ul-Abideen walked barefoot to his father's grave, unshackled now but still burdened. He fell into Sajdah there, pressing his forehead into the soil of sacrifice. "O Father," he whispered, "I have carried your message. I have walked through chains and lies. I have seen the tyrant's throne tremble. I am not worthy, but I will not let your voice be silenced." Lady Zainab stood nearby, tears in her eyes for the first time in weeks. "You did not fail him, Ali," she said softly. "You became his echo, his continuation, his answered prayer." The sun dipped behind the horizon, bathing Karbala in golden light. Birds flew overhead, and the wind picked up, dancing with the dust that had once soaked blood. Imam Zain-ul-Abideen sat beside his father's grave until nightfall, then rose slowly. When they returned to Medina, the people gathered in stunned silence. Children peeked from behind doors. Elders wept at the sight of Lady Zainab. The Imam, though frail, stood before the people and began to speak, not in anger, not in revenge, but with the aching clarity of one who had seen the deepest valley of pain and returned with wisdom. He taught the Qur'an. He prayed through nights. He wept in secret. And he never let Karbala fade. His supplications, deep, poetic, raw, became lifelines for hearts across generations. He raised Imam Muhammad Baqir with care, knowing the mission would pass to him. He did not live a life of comfort. He lived a life of purpose. And when the time came, years later, when poison crept into his veins and the cruelty of rulers once again sought to silence his voice, Imam Zain-ul-Abideen lay upon his bed, weak but unafraid. His last moments were spent in remembrance, in sajdah, in whispered verses. He had been chained, starved, humiliated, but never defeated. His light lived on, and still lives.